Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. This all happened a few months ago, and honestly, it still messes with me. I know it sounds like one of those cheesy horror movie setups, but trust me, this was real. It all started with me trying to find a decent TV for my apartment. I didn't want to spend a fortune on something brand new, so I was scouring Craigslist looking for a good deal. I wasn't really expecting anything special, just something to watch Netflix on and play a couple of games. Nothing too fancy, right? I wasn't looking for any haunted antiques or cursed objects, just a used TV that didn't cost me half my paycheck. I saw this post from a guy who was selling a flat screen for ridiculously cheap. The listing was super vague, just a picture of the TV and a one-sentence description that said, "Great condition. Needs a new home." Nothing about why it was so cheap, but I figured it didn't hurt to check it out. I reached out to the seller, and within a few hours, he texted me back with his address. He sounded nice enough, said he had to move out of his place and was getting rid of some things. No big deal, right? I asked it worked perfectly, and he said it was in great shape. The only catch was that I had to come pick it up from his apartment, which was a bit of a drive from mine, but whatever. I was eager to get the deal done and have a new TV. When I got there, the guy was already waiting outside, holding the TV under his arm. I was surprised by how light it was. It was a pretty decent size, and I expected it to weigh more. The guy looked like he was in a hurry to get rid of it, which was a little weird, but I didn't think much of it. He didn't seem too sketchy, just a regular dude, maybe in his 30s, a little disheveled, but nothing that screamed dangerous. I paid him in cash, thanked him, and packed the TV into my car. Once I got back to my place, I was pretty stoked. I hooked it up to my console, connected the cables, and turned it on. The screen flashed to life, and I was about to load up Netflix when I noticed something strange. The TV had a DVD tray. It wasn't a smart TV or anything fancy, just a regular old flat screen, but for some reason there was a DVD in the tray. I didn't remember the guy saying anything about it, and I sure as hell didn't ask for a DVD player. At first, I thought maybe he just left a movie in there by accident, and it was one of those weird things you find in used electronics. I tried to eject the DVD, but the screen froze for a second, and then it just popped out on its own. Curious, I took the DVD out and saw that it was unlabeled, just a plain black disc. Something about it felt off, but I figured it was just some random movie he'd thrown in there. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy about it. The guy hadn't mentioned anything about a disc, and I started to wonder if it was something personal. Like, did he leave it on purpose? I figured it'd be best to just throw it in the DVD player and check it out, maybe just to see if it was worth keeping. If it was a weird documentary or an old home movie, then whatever, I could always toss it. I popped the disc into the player, sat back on my couch, and waited. The TV blinked for a second, then went dark like it was loading. A few moments passed, and then the screen lit up with static for a second before a strange image appeared. It wasn't a typical movie intro or anything. It was just black and white symbols, almost like a bunch of random shapes, spirals, and lines. It didn't make sense. I figured it was some experimental film or an art project. But then, a sound came through the speakers, this low, eerie hum. It was so faint at first, I wasn't sure if I was hearing it right. But as the screen flashed, the hum turned into this high-pitched screech like nails on a chalkboard. It felt like it was coming from inside my head. I reached for the remote to turn it off, but before I could, the symbols on the screen started to distort. The colors warped, and the noise grew louder and more intense, almost unbearable. That's when I saw something that made my heart stop. It was a face, horribly distorted like it was melting. Eyes bulging, mouth twisted in some kind of scream, but no sound came from it. I couldn't look away. It was like the screen was pulling me in. I swear, the face kept getting closer, and the symbols kept shifting in ways that made my head hurt. I didn't even know what was happening. Why would a random DVD look like this? What was this even supposed to be? I felt this cold sweat starting to form on my back, and my whole body froze up. I reached for the remote again, but the buttons weren't working. The TV wouldn't turn off, and the face on the screen kept screaming silently at me. It felt like I was trapped in the moment, the noise filling the room, the face burning into my brain. That's when I heard it, a shrill, demonic scream blasting from the speakers. It shook me to my core. I finally managed to yank the power cord out of the TV, cutting off the screen and the noise. My hands were shaking, and I just sat there in the silence for a minute trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing. Had I really just seen that? Was that real? I stood up, grabbing the DVD and throwing it across the room, my heart still pounding in my chest. The symbols on the disc were burned into my memory, and I could still hear the scream echoing in my ears. I didn't know what to think. I just sat there staring at the TV, too freaked out to do anything else. After a few minutes, I plugged the TV back in and it seemed to work fine, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep it. I thought about calling the guy who sold it to me, but I had no idea how to explain what happened. It wasn't like he'd slipped a haunted DVD into the deal intentionally, right? It was just a freak accident, or so I tried to convince myself. I ended up getting rid of the TV, tossing it back on Craigslist just a few days later. I didn't even want to think about what could have been on that disc or why the hell it was even in there. I've never been able to ignore that I bought something more than just a TV that day. The symbols, the scream, it still haunts me. And every time I pass by a used electronics listing now, I wonder who else might have come across something like that. So yeah, next time you buy something on Craigslist, just make sure it's not hiding something you can't unsee. So, here's the deal. A few months ago, I was in the process of selling my Honda sports bike. It was a bike I'd had for years, but honestly, I just wasn't riding it as much anymore. It was in perfect condition, and I figured it was time to let it go to someone who could appreciate it more than I could at that point. I listed it on Craigslist, knowing it would probably take a while to sell, but honestly, I didn't care too much. It was just a bike, right? The first few responses were from typical buyers, people who just wanted to haggle or throw out lowball offers. I wasn't interested in wasting time with any of them. But then I got a message from this guy who seemed genuinely interested. He wasn't just asking for a discount or nitpicking the price. He asked all the right questions about the bike, mentioned that he had experience with sport bikes, and even talked about how he used to own a similar model. He sounded like the kind of buyer I could deal with, and after a few back and forths, we agreed to meet in person for a test ride. We set up a time, and when the day came, I was ready. I cleaned the bike, checked everything over again just to be sure it was in tip-top shape, and made sure I had the title and all the paperwork ready to go. I wasn't expecting anything strange to happen. I thought it'd be a straightforward deal. I mean, who wouldn't want to test ride a well-kept, fast bike? He showed up right on time, and at first glance, he seemed like just another guy who loved bikes. He was in his late 20s, wearing a casual leather jacket and jeans. He looked the part, definitely someone who seemed like he knew his stuff when it came to motorcycles. He seemed friendly, maybe even a little overly eager, but I didn't think much of it. We chatted briefly about the bike, and he immediately started asking if he could take it for a ride. I wasn't worried at that point. He seemed trustworthy. Now, I'm no rookie when it comes to selling stuff on Craigslist. I've sold a few things over the years, so I knew the drill. I told him I need some sort of security while he took the bike for a spin, standard procedure, right? He was cool with it, and he handed me his driver's license. I didn't think twice about it. I looked it over quickly just to make sure it was valid, and I took a mental note of the name and address. Nothing seemed off about it. He left to take the bike for a ride, and I settled in to wait. I figured he'd be back in about 15 minutes or so, enough time for a test ride, and to get a feel for the bike. So I just sat on the porch, scrolling through my phone, enjoying the peaceful afternoon. But then time started dragging on. 15 minutes turned into 30 minutes, then 45 minutes. At this point, I started to feel a little uneasy. I mean, it's a test ride, not a cross-country trip. It's not like the guy was going for a joyride in the mountains. I figured maybe he was just taking the scenic route, so I didn't panic right away. But after an hour, I started getting really weirded out. I had the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. I'd been sitting on the porch watching the street, and there was no sign of him anywhere. I could feel the knots forming in my stomach. Why hadn't he come back? Was this normal? I decided to check his driver's license again. I pulled it out of my pocket just to make sure everything was fine. But the more I looked at it, the more something didn't sit right with me. I had only given it a quick glance earlier, but now I took a closer look at the details. The name on the license was generic enough, but there was something about the photo that felt off. The font on the card looked a little too clean, almost like it had been freshly printed. And when I checked the address, I realized it didn't match up with what he'd said. It was a place that didn't exist. My heart started racing. I felt this creeping sense of dread that I couldn't shake off. My mind was running in 100 directions, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this guy some sort of con artist? Or worse, was he just trying to scam me? At this point, it was well over an hour, and I was beginning to get nervous. I could feel my palms sweating. I walked around the house, checking every corner of the yard. Still nothing. I debated calling the cops, but I hesitated, not knowing if I was just overreacting. Maybe he was just taking his sweet time on the ride. But deep down, I knew something was off. So I decided to take one more step. I called the number he'd given me when we first arranged the test ride. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. That was it. I couldn't wait any longer. I immediately started thinking about what my options were. Could he be stealing the bike, or was he just trying to run off with it without paying? Either way, I was done waiting. I quickly called a friend of mine who was a police officer. He told me to stay put and not engage with the guy if I saw him again. A few minutes later, my friend showed up with another officer. We searched the neighborhood and called in the bike's VIN number to see if it was reported stolen, just in case. I couldn't believe what had happened. The guy who had seemed so normal, so trustworthy, had disappeared without a trace. A few days later, I did some digging of my own. I found out the license he'd given me was a fake. I couldn't believe how elaborate it was, nothing I would ever suspected. He'd somehow managed to fool me with a counterfeit ID, and he'd been gone with my bike. To this day, I still don't know who he was or what his real intentions were. Maybe he was just a lowlife looking to make a quick buck, or maybe he had something darker planned. Either way, I learned the hard way that you can never be too careful with people you meet online, no matter how normal they seem at first. So yeah, don't trust just anyone, especially when it comes to Craigslist. If I had done a little more digging or asked more questions, maybe things would have turned out differently. But I'll never forget how quickly someone can make you feel like a fool. The worst part, I still hadn't gotten my bike back. A few months ago, I came across an ad on Craigslist that seemed like the perfect opportunity. A house-sitting gig for a large, isolated mansion just outside of town. The owner, a guy named Thomas, claimed he was going to be out of town for a few weeks and needed someone to take care of the place while he was gone. The pay was good, and the mansion looked amazing in the pictures, huge, old, and with a bunch of space for me to stretch out and relax. It sounded like a dream. Little did I know, that mansion would become my nightmare. The ad seemed legit at first. He was polite, clear about everything, and we exchanged a few messages about what the job would entail. Just keep the place clean, water the plants, and of course, make sure nothing goes wrong. I mean, I've done house-sitting gigs before, but never something this big or secluded. But I figured why not? It would be a change of scenery, and I could use the cash. I was looking forward to spending a few weeks in a quiet, beautiful house. When I first arrived at the mansion, I was pretty impressed. The place was massive, sitting on acres of land with a long, winding driveway. The architecture was old but elegant, and the inside was full of antiques and huge windows that let in tons of light. There was a little guest room all set up for me, complete with a comfy bed and a huge closet. The whole place gave off a weird vibe, but in a wow, this is beautiful kind of way. Honestly, I didn't think too much about it at first. It just seemed like a grand old house. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. I followed his instructions, watered the plants, and made sure the house stayed in order. But then things started to get weird. It wasn't anything huge at first, just little oddities that started to pile up. For example, I noticed that one of the doors in the kitchen wouldn't lock properly. I tried it a few times, but it just wouldn't latch. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the door was old and the lock was just jammed. Still, it was strange because all the other doors locked fine. Then there were the whispers at night. At first, I thought I was hearing things. But on the second or third night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep when I heard something. Just faint whispers coming from the hallway. I got up, walked around, but there was no one there. I checked the whole house, even the closets, thinking maybe there was someone hiding or maybe the sound was coming from outside. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next thing that caught my attention was the strange smell that seemed to come and go. It wasn't like a regular musty smell you'd expect in an old house. It was more like damp like wet earth mixed with something sour. It would hit me in different parts of the house, mostly near the old library. The smell would linger for a while and then fade, but it always seemed to show up when I was alone. It made me feel uneasy, like something was watching me from the shadows. But the real kicker came on the fifth night. I had just finished watering the plants in the garden and was getting ready to settle in for the night when I noticed something strange. A door that I hadn't noticed before, hidden in a corner of a hallway. It was a small wooden door that blended in with the wall. The kind of door you wouldn't really notice unless you were looking for it. I'm not sure how I missed it at first, but there it was, standing ajar. Naturally, my curiosity got the best of me. I went over to the door and pushed it open, only to find a narrow staircase leading down into a dark, stone-walled basement. The air that rushed up from the stairs was cold and musty, and it sent a chill down my spine. I debated whether or not to go down there, but the curiosity ate at me. I'd been exploring the rest of the house and had never come across this part before. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight, heading down the steps cautiously. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, and the further I went, the darker it got. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. It was cramped and full of old furniture covered in dust. There were stacks of boxes, old lamps, and what looked like an old wardrobe in the corner. Nothing too out of the ordinary, except for the creepy vibe. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding like I wasn't supposed to be down there. That's when I noticed something odd, scratches on the floor, deep and fresh looking like something had been dragged across the stone. And then I saw it. There was a small door at the far end of the basement. It was locked, but the lock was different from the rest of the doors in the house. I stepped closer, examining it, but just as I was about to turn the knob, I heard footsteps upstairs. Someone was walking around. I froze, listening, but the footsteps stopped. It was quiet again. I didn't want to be caught down there, so I hurried back up the stairs, leaving the locked door untouched. When I made it back to the main floor, I felt a sense of relief, but also a rising sense of dread. I didn't know who or what was in that basement, but something was off. The next day, I went over to the door again. This time, I decided to get a closer look at the locked basement door. I pulled on the handle, but it was solid, no way to get in. I felt like I was being drawn into something I shouldn't be messing with. As the days passed, I noticed more and more strange things. The whispers continued at night, sometimes louder, like they were coming from inside the walls. The door that wouldn't lock started acting even stranger. Sometimes it would lock itself. Sometimes it would unlock when I wasn't around. And every time I walked near that hidden door in the basement, I felt a cold hand on the back of my neck urging me to turn around. The whole place just felt wrong. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called Thomas, the owner, to ask him about the door in the basement. He said it was nothing to worry about, just a storage area he didn't use. But the way he said it, the tension in his voice, told me he was lying. Something about that place didn't add up, and I didn't feel safe anymore. I ended up leaving the mansion early. I didn't want to take any chances. As soon as I packed up and left, the feeling of being watched didn't go away, but at least I was out of there. I'll never forget that house, and I'll never forget the feeling of being drawn into something dark and sinister that I wasn't meant to understand. If you ever see a listing on Craigslist for house sitting gigs, especially for places that are way too isolated, take it from me, don't go. Some doors are meant to stay closed. I've always been pretty cautious about who I trust, especially when it comes to living with strangers. But like most college students, I needed to find a place to live. Renting was expensive and my budget was tight. So when I saw the Craigslist ad for a roommate offering a ridiculously cheap rent for an apartment in a nice neighborhood, I thought I hit the jackpot. The pictures were perfect. The apartment was spacious, clean, and modern. Honestly, I figured it was too good to be true, but curiosity got the best of me and I decided to reach out. The person who responded to my message was a guy named Daniel. He seemed friendly enough, said he worked from home and was just looking for someone to help with rent. He sounded pretty normal in the emails, so we set up a time to meet in person. I wasn't expecting much, but the first time I walked into that apartment, I felt like I was stepping into a dream. It was immaculate, almost unnervingly perfect. Every single thing was in its place, no dust, no clutter. The furniture was arranged just right, and the apartment smelled faintly of fresh flowers and some kind of clean linen scent. Daniel greeted me at the door with a smile, looking exactly like his photos. He was friendly, talkative, and made sure to show me around the place. "This is the living room, kitchen, the guest bathroom," he said, pointing to everything with pride. He even gave me a small tour of his room, where everything was neatly organized, nothing out of place, not a single thing on the floor. I was impressed. Who was an apartment this perfect? It felt almost staged, like something you'd see in a showroom, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I guess I just chalked it up to him being a really clean person. We sat down, and he asked me about my school and work. He was polite, and everything seemed normal. I figured I was being paranoid about the whole too perfect thing. After about an hour of chatting, we made arrangements for me to move in a few days later. I was excited in my own place, rent that was affordable, and a clean environment to live in. What could go wrong? The first few days were fine. I settled in, unpacked my things, and tried to make the apartment feel a little more like home. Daniel was still as friendly as ever, but I started noticing some things that didn't sit right with me. The first was the way he acted when I'd run into him around the apartment. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but every time I saw him, he'd be talking to himself. Not in a casual, mumbling to yourself kind of way, but full-on conversations with no one. His voice would rise and fall like he was having a back-and-forth discussion with an invisible person, and it would happen when I'd walk past him in the hallway, or while he was cooking in the kitchen. It didn't seem like he was on the phone either, no headphones or anything. It was just him talking to the air. At first, I brushed it off. People are weird, right? Maybe he was just one of those people who like to talk through their thoughts. But the more I heard it, the more it started to get unsettling. Then there was the scratching. It started one night while I was lying in bed trying to sleep. I thought I heard a soft scratching sound coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe an animal outside, but then it happened again and again. It wasn't consistent, but it was definitely there, deep like fingernails dragging across wood. It freaked me out, but I didn't say anything to Daniel. I figured it was just my imagination. But as the days passed, it got worse. The scratching seemed to be coming from different parts of the apartment, not just the walls. Sometimes it was the floor, sometimes the door frames. It was constant, like whatever was scratching was trying to break through. I would hear it when I was in the shower, when I was watching TV, when I was in my room at night trying to sleep. It got to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. One day, I decided to talk to Daniel about it. I asked him if he had noticed the noise. He gave me this weird look, like he didn't understand what I was talking about, but then he just shrugged and said, "Oh, that. It's probably just the building settling. It's old. The noise is harmless." I didn't buy it, but I didn't press him further. It was his apartment, and maybe he knew something I didn't. But the longer I stayed, the more things started to feel off. Daniel started acting stranger. The conversations he was having with himself got more intense. He would shout things like, "Why didn't he listen?" Or, "I told you to stay quiet," in a voice that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He'd scratch at the walls and mutter incoherently, his movements jerky and erratic. It wasn't just his behavior. The apartment started feeling colder. Even when the heat was on, I'd walk into rooms and feel like I was stepping into a freezer. It didn't make sense. And the scratching noises. They became more frequent, more urgent, like something was trying to claw its way out of the walls. One night, I woke up to the sound of loud baying coming from the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to stay still, listening. The baying was getting closer, almost like someone was running up and down the hall, hitting the walls with something. I was terrified. I was about to get up and check, but then I heard Daniel's voice, loud and clear, coming from the kitchen. But this time, it wasn't like the usual mumbling. He was shouting. "I told you to stay inside. You should have stayed inside." He screamed, his voice trembling with anger. The words were followed by an eerie silence, and then the scratching started again, this time louder than ever. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong. I didn't care if I had signed a lease or what kind of mess this would cause. I packed up my things that night and left. I didn't care about the rent. I didn't care about the perfect apartment. I just had to get out. The thing that still haunts me. As I was leaving, I heard Daniel's voice again, but this time it wasn't from the kitchen or anywhere I could see. It was behind me, from somewhere in the walls, whispering my name. I don't know what's going on in that apartment, but I don't plan on finding out. I'm just thankful I got what I did. I've been looking for a job for months. It feels like the world just keeps passing me by while I'm stuck in this constant cycle of sending out resumes and waiting for callbacks that never come. I had hit a point where I'd applied to anything that sounded remotely like it could get me a paycheck. When I found the Craigslist listing for a job as a personal assistant, I was skeptical but curious. The description was vague but professional, and the pay was way more than I expected for something that seemed so simple. At that point, I wasn't in a position to question it. I sent over my resume, got an email back the next day, and before I knew it, I was set to meet the hiring manager for an in-person interview. The building was a bit out of the way, but it was an office complex, so I figured it was just one of those places that had a bunch of companies in it. I wasn't thinking anything weird at the time. I had been to interviews in similar buildings before. When I got there, though, I noticed something felt a little off. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just a couple of cars scattered around. That wasn't unusual, but what threw me off was the building itself. The outside was fine, no cracks, no boarded up windows, but the closer I got to the entrance, the more I realized something was strange. It felt quiet, too quiet. I brushed it off, told myself it was probably just an older building. I was overthinking things. I walked in through the glass doors, and the moment I stepped into the lobby, I noticed the silence again. No bustling employees, no sounds of phones ringing or keyboards clacking. The place had an eerie stillness to it. The receptionist desk was unmanned, and the lights overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the cold, empty space. A faint smell of stale air lingered, which immediately made me question whether I had come to the right place. I checked the address on the email just to make sure, and yes, this was the spot. I hadn't gotten lost. A man appeared from around the corner, a middle-aged guy in a dark suit. His hair was a little unkempt, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He gave me a thin smile and introduced himself as Jason, the hiring manager. I shook his hand, trying to ignore the discomfort that was creeping up on me. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, but I told myself to relax. He invited me to follow him down the hallway. The building's interior was worse than I imagined. Everything looked old, not the charming vintage kind of old, but the neglected for too long kind of old. The walls were bare except for some generic motivational posters, and the lights above buzzed as we walked down the hall. It was like I had entered a place that time forgot. There was no warmth to the office, no personal touches, no sign that anyone had worked there in a long time. Jason led me to a conference room at the end of the hallway. Inside, there was a long table with a few chairs and some papers scattered around. He motioned for me to sit across from him. At first, we talked about the position, typical interview questions where I had worked before, why I was looking for something new. Nothing unusual. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized there were no other employees. He kept going on about how great the company was, how I'd be a key part of an exciting new project. But the more he talked, the more I felt like something wasn't right. The words felt rehearsed, like he was saying them just to fill the silence. The conversation started to drag on, and I couldn't help but notice that Jason seemed to be getting more distant. His responses became less about the job and more about my personal life. He asked me about my family, my hobbies, even my friends. I didn't mind talking, but it was getting a little uncomfortable. I tried to steer the conversation back to the position, but every time I did, he would just repeat himself about how great this opportunity was. I checked my watch. I had been in the building for nearly an hour, and no one had come in or out. There wasn't a single sound coming from the other side of the building. It was almost like I had stepped into some kind of weird parallel universe. Every time I tried to excuse myself, Jason would distract me with another question or story. He seemed oddly determined to keep me in that room. Finally, after a long pause, he stood up. "Let me show you the rest of the building," he said. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen a single other person yet, and I had a weird feeling about following him. Something told me to just get out of there, but the logical part of me kept saying that I was probably overthinking things. I needed a job, and I had to follow through with this. We left the conference room and walked down a long, dimly lit hallway. The further we walked, the more desolate the building seemed. I couldn't believe this place was meant to house a business. We passed empty offices with closed doors and blank windows, and I started to feel the weight of the silence around me. Jason stopped at the door of an office, put his hand on the handle, and turned to me. "We just need to finish a couple of things in here. It won't take long." I could see through the crack in the door that the room was completely dark. I hesitated for a second, but before I could protest, Jason opened the door and stepped inside. Something in my gut told me that this was my chance to leave, but I froze for a second too long. As I stepped into the office, I realized there was no desk, no chair, nothing except a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. It gave off a sickly yellow light that made the room feel even more claustrophobic. Jason stepped further into the darkness, and I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. I jumped, my heart racing in my chest. Suddenly, the air seemed heavier and Jason was much closer than he had been before. He hadn't moved, but his presence felt overwhelming. The silence in the room was suffocating. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get out. I turned around and rushed for the door, pulling at the handle desperately. It wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, my hands shaking. I glanced back at him. Jason hadn't moved, but his face looked different now, almost like he was waiting for me to make the wrong move. My mind was racing, but I didn't have time to think anymore. I threw my shoulder against the door, and this time it gave way, slamming open. I ran down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the entrance. I didn't even look back. I didn't care about the job anymore. I didn't care about the paycheck. I just wanted to get out of there. I don't know what that place was or why I was the only one there, but something tells me I'll never be the same after that day. It was the job of a lifetime, and I didn't take it. Thank God. It's crazy how the smallest things can suddenly spark a flood of memories. I was scrolling through Craigslist one evening, killing time, when something caught my eye. It wasn't the usual stuff. Furniture, apartments, jobs, or whatever. No, this one was a listing that made my stomach twist. It was a reward offer for information about a missing person. The name on the ad was Matthew. My old friend Matthew. The one I lost contact with years ago. We were close back in high school, but after graduation, we kind of just drifted. He was the kind of guy who always had something going on, and he didn't exactly keep in touch. I don't think we even had a falling out or anything. It was just life, you know. We got busy, people change, and all of a sudden, you realize you haven't heard from someone in months, then years. But Matthew, I never forgot about him. And when I saw his name pop up on that ad, my heart skipped a beat. The listing was short and straight to the point. It offered a reward for any leads on Matthew's whereabouts. The ad didn't really give any details, just that you'd been missing for a few months, and that anyone with information should contact the person who posted it. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. I hadn't thought about Matthew in a while, but the idea that something had happened to him, that didn't sit right with me. The weirdest part. The ad didn't mention his last name, but I knew it was him. I could feel it in my gut. I clicked the reply button without overthinking it. What could it hurt, right? Maybe I was being dramatic, but the curiosity was eating at me. The idea of reaching out, getting some answers, and maybe even helping if I could, it felt like the right thing to do. The response came quickly within minutes. The person on the other end thanked me for reaching out and mentioned they were trying to gather information about Matthew, who had seemingly vanished without a trace. They also asked if I had known him well. I told them I had been close friends with him years ago, but hadn't heard from him in a long time. It felt good to get that off my chest, honestly. That's when things started to get weird. The person started asking more and more questions about Matthew and me. At first, I didn't think much of it. They asked about how we met, how we used to hang out, if there was anything odd about his behavior before he disappeared. Simple stuff. But then they asked a question that made me pause. Was there ever any tension between you two? Any arguments? Anything that might have made him want to leave? I didn't like that question. It felt invasive, like they were trying to dig into something personal, something that had nothing to do with the situation. Matthew and I hadn't fallen out. We were just two guys who lost touch. Why would they ask something like that? Still, I answered as best I could, even though I felt a little uneasy. There had been no drama between us. So I typed back, trying to keep it casual, but the next reply from the stranger made my stomach tighten. It didn't just seem curious anymore. It felt like they were probing, like they were too interested. Do you remember the last time you saw Matthew? The last time you spoke to him? What were you doing? Where were you? Who else was there? The questions were getting more specific, more personal. Something about the way they were phrased made me feel like they already knew the answers, like they were testing me. But I wasn't about to stop replying just yet. I needed to know more, and at this point, I was so deep in the conversation that backing out felt impossible. I asked them if they knew anything about his disappearance. They replied almost immediately, but their answer only made things more confusing. I've been following his trail for a while, but something doesn't add up. Do you remember when he started acting off? What was he like towards the end? I'm trying to figure out if there's anything we missed. That comment hit me like a ton of bricks. What do they mean by acting off? Matthew had always been a bit unpredictable, funny, sometimes a little strange, but nothing that would make him disappear like this, but something in the way the person asked. It was like they were trying to convince me that something had been wrong, that I had missed some red flags, but I didn't remember anything unusual. The questions kept coming, more and more personal, more invasive. It felt like they weren't just looking for information about Matthew anymore. They were trying to dig into my life too. Where had I been when I last saw him? What time of day was it? Had we been alone? Had anyone else been around? They kept pressing, trying to make me give details I wasn't sure I should. I started feeling more and more like I was being pushed into a corner. But the real kicker came when they asked about a detail I didn't remember ever sharing. Was Matthew wearing a jacket the last time you saw him? The one he always wore? The dark leather one with the white stitching. I froze. The leather jacket. That was his jacket, the one he wore everywhere, even in the summer. I hadn't mentioned anything about it in my responses. How did they know about the jacket? Had Matthew mentioned it? Maybe I was forgetting something, but I hadn't mentioned that detail at all. The message came through. I think I know where he is. I think I know what happened to him. You don't need to worry. You'll get answers soon enough. That's when I got a bad feeling, one that made my heart race and my palms sweat. The conversation started to feel less like an attempt to find Matthew and more like a trap. I stopped replying, but the messages kept coming, one after the other. My phone buzzed constantly, like they knew I was reading them, but I didn't want to reply anymore. I blocked them. A few days passed, and I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. But then late one night, I received an email. The subject line was Matthew's jacket. I didn't even open it. My heart started racing again, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I deleted the email and kept the phone off for the rest of the night. I have no idea who that person was or what they wanted. I haven't heard anything about Matthew since, and the ad is gone now. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I wonder if Matthew is out there, and if the person who posted that ad was looking for him or something else, something darker. I'm not sure I want to know the truth anymore. I never thought Craigslist would be the place where I'd encounter something like this. I'd always thought of it as a place to find furniture, random stuff, and maybe some job listings. I'd browsed it plenty of times before, but I never imagined it'd lead to anything out of the ordinary. That was until I saw the personal ad. It was simple enough, just a looking for new friends kind of thing. The post wasn't anything out of the blue, just some person reaching out, wanting to chat, make me up. I didn't have much going on that night, so I figured, why not? It wasn't like I had anything to lose, right? So I messaged them. I'll admit, I didn't really think much of it. I've always been kind of a curious person, especially when it comes to meeting new people. After a few hours, I got a reply. They were friendly enough at first, just small talk. We shared some basic stuff about ourselves, what we did for fun, our hobbies, that kind of thing. Honestly, it seemed pretty normal. They said their name was Alex, and we had a lot in common. Both of us like hiking the outdoors, and we even shared some similar interests in movies. I was feeling pretty good about the conversation. Nothing too strange, just two people chatting. But then the questions started getting a little odd. At first, it was just things like, where do you live? And what do your parents do? I didn't think much of it. People ask questions like that when they're just trying to get to know you, right? So I answered casually, saying I lived in a pretty quiet neighborhood. My parents worked regular jobs, and I didn't think anything was off. But then the next question threw me off guard a bit. Do you have any siblings? I hesitated for a second. It was just an odd thing to ask so quickly, but I shrugged it off. I told them I had an older brother, not really thinking much of it. But then Alex followed it up with, what's his name? What does he do? Now that was weird. I don't even tell random people about my family like that, especially when I barely knew them. I almost closed the app right then and there, but something made me keep going. Maybe it was the weird vibe I was getting with the curiosity of why they were asking these personal questions. So I just said, look, I'm not really comfortable talking about my family like that, and added something about respecting my privacy. I thought that would end it, but it didn't. They just wouldn't let it go. They kept asking more and more about my life, the people I cared about, where I spent my time. It felt like they were trying to piece together every little detail. And the more they asked, the more it felt like they already knew stuff that I hadn't told them. I don't know how, but it seemed like they knew the general area I lived in, like they knew what my neighborhood was like. It felt like they were baiting me into saying something specific, something I hadn't even mentioned. I started getting really uncomfortable. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it creeping in. So I decided it was time to leave. I had enough. I sent a short message saying, I think I'm going to call it a night. This has been fun, but I'm not feeling comfortable anymore. I expected them to just drop it to let me go, but that's not what happened. Instead, Alex kept pushing. Just stay a little longer. We're just getting to know each other, aren't we? Don't you want to talk more? It wasn't just the words, but the tone of the message that made my skin crawl. I could feel the insistence in every letter. They weren't just trying to keep me talking, they were trying to control the situation. I told them no. I told them I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to go. But they kept pushing. Just a few more minutes. I promise you'll like it. I'll make it worth your time. I stopped responding. For a second, I thought maybe that was it. I figured they'd get the hint. But a few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. I looked at the message and froze. There was no, hey, no friendly greeting. Just, I know where you live. My heart dropped into my stomach. The hell? How could they know that? I hadn't told them anything that specific, not even about the neighborhood. This was starting to feel way too real. They were clearly watching me somehow. It was like they were tracking my every move, piecing together every little thing I said. My hands started shaking. I immediately blocked the person, but the weird thing was I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, waiting, like they were going to keep trying to get to me no matter how much I blocked them. And here's the kicker. The next day, I decided to go to the store to clear my head. When I stepped outside, I felt like something was off. My neighborhood was pretty quiet, but there was this weird tension in the air. Something felt different, like eyes were on me. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just paranoia. But when I got to the store, I ran into someone I knew, or rather, someone I thought I knew. I didn't recognize them at first, but they looked so familiar, and then it hit me. They looked exactly like the person in the profile picture from that Craigslist conversation. I felt my stomach turn. I didn't know what to do. I quickly turned around and left the store, heart racing. Ever since that day, I haven't seen them again. And I haven't gotten any more strange messages. But I can't help feeling like they're out there, watching, waiting. I have no idea how they found me, but I'm starting to think that Craigslist wasn't just a random website to meet people. It was a trap. I'm staying as far away from any ads like that from now on. I was never the type to go for big purchases. I always like finding bargains and hunting down free stuff. So when I saw a Craigslist ad offering a free washer and dryer, I jumped on it. The person said they were moving and needed to get rid of the appliances ASA. I was living in a tiny apartment and had been using the laundromat for months, so this was the perfect chance to save some money and have a washer and dryer in my place. I replied to the ad without hesitation, thinking it was just another simple Craigslist fight. The seller was quick to get back to me. They seemed pretty normal in the messages, just saying I could come by any time to pick them up. They didn't ask for any personal information, and everything seemed chill. I made sure to check the photos they sent, and the appliances looked decent enough, though they were older models. I wasn't picky. After all, it was free. The day I went to pick them up, I had a good feeling about it. I even brought a friend along just in case things got weird. We drove out to the place, which was in a quiet, somewhat secluded neighborhood. The house wasn't huge, but it was nice. It looked like something you'd see in an older part of town, with a big yard and a long driveway. When I pulled up, I realized how odd the situation was. The house was empty. I mean, there were no cars in the driveway. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and there was no sign of life inside. It seemed like no one had lived there for a while, except for the appliances in the front room, which were the only things visible through the window. I paused for a second, feeling a weird gut instinct telling me something was off, but I shrugged it off. I thought it was just a normal move-out situation. People don't always clean up after themselves, right? I knocked on the door and waited. A few moments later, it opened, and the seller was standing there. They were older, probably in their mid-50s, and they greeted me with a big, overly friendly smile. They didn't look like anything out of the ordinary, but something about the way they looked at me made me feel uneasy. They invited me in, and I stepped inside. The house was eerily empty, like completely empty. The only thing in the entire place were the washer and dryer. Not a single piece of furniture. No lamps, no pictures on the walls, no rugs or chairs. It was just a shell of a house, and that made me feel uncomfortable. I thought about leaving, but then the seller started talking, and I figured I could at least get the appliances loaded up before bailing. The seller insisted on helping us load the washer and dryer into my car, even though I told them I could manage it. That was a nice gesture at first. They were a little older, so I didn't expect them to be able to lift much, but they seemed eager. They moved with an odd kind of energy, almost like they were too eager, if that makes sense. It was almost as if they were trying too hard to make me comfortable, but something felt off about their insistence. As I was helping load the dryer into my car, I noticed something. There were faint, reddish-brown smudges on the walls, just under the edges of the windows. At first, I thought it was just old dirt or something, but when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. The smudges looked like handprints, and not just any handprints. These were small and smeared in odd ways, as though someone had been dragging their hands across the walls. I froze for a second, unsure whether I should say anything, but I didn't. I tried to focus on the task at hand, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The seller didn't seem to notice me looking at the walls. They were too busy helping with the washer, making strange comments like, "It's a shame to see this house go. So many good memories in this place." And then, out of nowhere, they said, sometimes the past just doesn't want to be forgotten. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just smiled awkwardly and kept lifting the washer. As I moved the last piece into the car, I glanced back at the walls again. The handprints were more distinct now. There were definitely bloody, dried blood. I wasn't sure how I hadn't noticed it before, but now that I was really looking at it, I felt like my brain was trying to make sense of something that didn't add up. I didn't want to think about it, but I started wondering if the seller had been living here alone, or if they had been involved in something darker. I didn't know how to explain the feeling, but it was like I was standing in a place that had been untouched for far too long. Like something had happened here, and it was still sticking to the place. I tried to shake off the thoughts and get the washer and dryer into the car as quickly as possible, but the seller kept following me. They were too close, standing in my personal space as I loaded the last item. I could feel their eyes on me, watching my every move, and it started to feel like I was being trapped in a corner. Before I left, the seller stopped me at the door, smiling again, but this time with an unsettling intensity. "I hope they serve you well," they said. Then they added, "It's funny how some things just stay with you, isn't it? The past always follows you." That line sent a cold chill down my spine. I nodded quickly, thanked them, and rushed out the door. My friend and I threw the washer and dryer into the car, not saying a word, and we got out of there as fast as we could. The whole ride home, I kept thinking about the handprints. They were still burned into my mind. I kept telling myself that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just old blood. Maybe it was some kind of weird DIY project gone wrong. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. I never went back to that place, and I deleted the Craigslist ad the moment I got home. There are a lot of things I could try to explain away, but the feeling of being watched, the weird, almost suffocating insistence of the seller, and those bloody handprints on the wall are not things I can forget. It's been months now, and sometimes I still think about it. I still wonder if I made it out in time or if there's something else waiting for me next time. I'll never forget the day it all happened. It started out like a normal Saturday. I was scrolling through Craigslist, as I usually do, just checking out job listings, random ads, and maybe looking for something to do on the weekend. That's when I saw the post. The headline read something like, "Unique Opportunity. Quick work for a lot of money," with a vague description about needing someone for a short task that would pay really well. I thought to myself, why not? What I got to lose? At first glance, the ad seemed harmless. I mean, it didn't have the usual red flags that I'd normally look out for. No weird grammar or spelling errors. The person said they needed someone for a couple of hours of work in exchange for a decent amount of cash. That you can promise a surprise bonus for completing the task successfully. The location. A little off the beaten path, but nothing too crazy. I figured it was just some kind of freelance gig. So I replied to the ad, asking for more details. The person responded quickly, giving me an address. It was in a remote industrial area, kind of isolated from the main part of town. The email was simple, no extra fluff. They said to show up at 2 p.m., and that they'd explain everything when I got there. I wasn't worried at all. I've done some weird stuff for money in the past, and this didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. Sure, it wasn't your average office job, but hey, it'd be some easy cash, right? I got to the location a little early, just to be safe. The place was exactly as described, an old, run-down building surrounded by empty lots and abandoned warehouses. I was starting to feel a little uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I waited outside for about 20 minutes. No one showed up. The building was quiet, almost too quiet. I figured maybe they were just running a little late or maybe I had the wrong address. But then I heard the sound of an engine approaching from behind me. A van rolled up, a nondescript gray van with tinted windows. It stopped right in front of me and the engine shut off. The door slid open and two guys stepped out. That's when my stomach dropped. One of the guys looked way too familiar. It was a guy I had worked with on a construction site a few years back, just a short-term gig, nothing too memorable. His name was Mike, and I remembered him as kind of a shady character, always making jokes and acting like he had a secret he was keeping. I wasn't exactly friends with him, but I knew enough to know that he wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to run into on a Saturday afternoon, let alone show up for something like this. The other guy was a little older, maybe in his mid-40s, with dark hair and a rough, weathered face. He didn't look like someone you want to run into in an alley, let alone an abandoned building. They looked at each other for a moment, then back at me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Mike gave me a tight-lipped smile, and the older guy, who I hadn't recognized at all, spoke up first. They didn't introduce themselves or anything. Instead, they started with some small talk, asking how I was doing, what I had been up to lately. It felt weird, like they already knew the answers to those questions. I tried not to let on that I was uncomfortable, but I was starting to get a bad feeling. The older guy told me that they were just looking for someone to help out for a short job, and that the pay would be worth it. They said it would only take a couple of hours at most, and then I'd be on my way. They assured me that everything would be simple and no hassle. I wasn't so sure anymore. Something in their tone didn't sit right with me. They started asking me about my past work, my job history, and how I had been living. At first, it seemed casual, but the questions quickly became more personal, like really personal. I started to feel like I was being interviewed for something I wasn't quite understanding. The older guy asked me specific questions about my family, my friends, and even what my living situation was like. It was starting to feel more like an interrogation than a job offer. But I kept my cool. I didn't want to give them any reason to think I was getting nervous. I just figured I'd play along, get the job over with, and leave with my paycheck in hand. But when they asked me about past mistakes and certain jobs I had done, jobs I hadn't mentioned on my resume, I felt my pulse spike. How did they know about that? How could they know that? I started looking around trying to figure out how I was going to get out of there. I thought maybe I could make an excuse, say I had to leave, but the situation was already starting to feel wrong. The older guy kept smiling, but there was something off about it. His smile was too wide, too eager. He kept telling me that the job was easy and that everyone does it once in their life. But as the conversation dragged on, I realized what they were getting at. They were pushing me toward doing something illegal. They kept saying that it was no big deal, just a one-time thing, and that I wouldn't regret it. They mentioned money, a lot of money, but I wasn't stupid. I knew this wasn't a job offer anymore. It was a manipulation, a way to get me to do something I didn't want to do. It was clear they were pressuring me, trying to make me feel like I had no choice but to accept. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I started backing away slowly, trying to make my exit. But Mike, the guy I vaguely recognized, stepped closer to me, blocking the path. He looked me dead in the eyes, and I could see something in his expression that I didn't like, something that told me they weren't going to let me leave without doing what they wanted. Panic set in, and I turned around, heading for the exit. But as I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. They were following me. I didn't look back. I just ran. I sprinted down the street, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was far away from that building, and then I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't stop running until I reached a busy part of town. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed. Maybe I'd have done something I'd regret, or maybe they'd have made me do something I couldn't take back. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to find out. I still don't know what the job was, but I've learned to trust my instincts. When something feels off, it usually is. I was finally getting around to cleaning out my storage unit. It had been collecting dust for years, and the thought of sorting through old boxes and forgotten memories seemed like the perfect way to spend the day. The place was packed with random stuff I hadn't looked at in ages: furniture, clothes, old books, random knickknacks. But then, buried in the back corner of one of the boxes, I found it: an old vintage camera. It wasn't anything particularly fancy, just a regular film camera that looked like it had seen better days. But something about it caught my eye. Maybe it was the sleek design or the worn leather strap that gave it a certain charm. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. It was the kind of thing my grandfather would have kept, though. I had no use for it, but the thought of throwing it away felt wrong. So I decided to list it on Craigslist, figuring someone might be interested in a vintage camera. The ad went out that afternoon, and within a few hours I had a response. A woman named Lisa messaged me saying she was interested in the camera for a project. She was a photographer, and it sounded like this camera was exactly what she was looking for. I agreed to meet her the next day. When she showed up at my place, I could immediately tell she was eager to get her hands on it. Lisa was young, maybe in her early 20s, with short dark hair and a kind of quiet energy about her. She seemed friendly enough, but there was something odd about the way she looked at the camera as soon as she saw it in person. It was like she was almost entranced by it. We chatted for a bit while I showed her how the camera worked, and she asked a few questions about it. It was pretty typical stuff at first: what kind of camera it was, how old it was, if it was still in good condition. But then her questions started to get a little stranger. She asked where I got it from, and I told her that it had been my grandfather's. He was an avid photographer back in the day, and I remembered seeing him use this camera when I was younger. Liz's eyes seemed to brighten at that. She didn't immediately say anything, but I noticed her gaze linger on the camera, and then she asked, "Do you have any special memories with it?" I was a little taken aback by the question. I mean, sure, it had been my grandfather's, but it wasn't like the camera was some priceless relic or anything. It was just a tool, and there wasn't some deep, sentimental history tied to it. Still, I smiled and shrugged it off, telling her that it had been a part of my grandfather's life, but nothing too crazy had happened with it. Nothing I could remember anyway. Lisa didn't seem satisfied with that answer. She kept looking at the camera as if it held some secret she was trying to uncover. I could feel her eyes on me, and I started to feel a little uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. People get attached to old things, right? Maybe she was just one of those people who like to know the stories behind things. It was a vintage camera, after all. Who knows what it had captured over the years? Then came the next question that threw me off. She casually asked, "Do you mind if I take some pictures of you?" I blinked, caught off guard. At first, I thought she was just being friendly, wanting to get a shot of someone holding the camera or something. But then she continued, "In ballerina outfits. It'll be part of my project." I couldn't hide my confusion. Why would she want pictures of me dressed like a ballerina? I had never mentioned anything about being into ballet or anything related to it, and yet there she was, asking if I posed for her in a costume. I thought I misheard her at first, but she seemed so serious about it. She wasn't joking or laughing. It was just one of those random questions, but it felt like there was a deeper, more pressing reason behind it. It wasn't just about the camera anymore. I laughed awkwardly and said, I don't think that's really my thing, trying to keep things light." But she didn't let it go. She just nodded like she expected me to say that, and then added, "It's for my project. It's really important." I couldn't explain why, but the request was starting to feel more and more unsettling. It wasn't just the fact that she wanted me to wear a ballerina outfit. What was that even about? It was the way she was talking about it, like she already had it planned, like she knew something I didn't. It was starting to feel like this wasn't just some random photography project. There was something off about the way she was pushing for it, the way she kept circling around the topic. It was as if she was testing the waters, seeing how far she could push me. I told her again that I wasn't interested in doing anything like that, but she just nodded again, this time with an almost disappointed look. She seemed to accept it, but something still didn't sit right. She paid for the camera, handed me the cash, and left without saying much else. After she left, I thought I'd put the whole thing out of my mind. I had done my part. I sold the camera, she was happy, and that was that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just participated in something weird. I kept thinking about her strange obsession with the camera's history, the odd request for me to dress up, and how intense she had been about it. The next day, I couldn't help myself. I checked her social media. I know, it was a little creepy, but I was just curious. When I found her profile, there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Her photos were all art projects, but there was a pattern. Each one of them featured strange, almost surreal setups. People in weird costumes, strange poses, and unsettling environments. And sure enough, there was a picture of her in a ballerina outfit. Not just one, but multiple. And the more I scrolled, the more I realized that all her photos had this eerie, almost unnatural vibe to them. Some of them looked like they were staged in abandoned buildings. Others had odd shadows in the background, like there was something lurking just outside the frame. My stomach dropped as I came across a few more posts. Pictures of people who looked disturbingly familiar. I couldn't place why they looked familiar, but there was a gnawing sensation that I'd seen them somewhere before. I quickly closed the app and shoved my phone in my pocket, trying not to think about it. I had sold her a camera, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about the camera. It was about something else, something far more unsettling. I didn't know who she was, what she wanted, or what she was really up to. But I knew one thing: I didn't want to be part of it anymore. Craigslist can be a weird place, but I learned the hard way to trust my instincts. Some things are better left forgotten. I'll never forget the day I almost became a victim of a Craigslist scam gone horribly wrong. It started out usual, just another one of those transactions I've made 100 times before. I had this rare vintage guitar that I hadn't touched in years. It was a beauty, something I'd inherited from a family friend who passed away. I hadn't played it in ages, but I always knew it was worth something. I figured it was time to sell it. The ad I posted was simple enough: rare vintage guitar, excellent condition, price to sell. I was honest about the fact that I wasn't a player anymore, so it was just collecting dust in the corner of my room. I set a fair price and waited. Within a few hours, I had a response. The guy seemed interested, and after a quick exchange of messages, we agreed to meet up. He was a bit vague, saying he'd be happy to come check it out. Something about his message felt a little off, but I pushed the thought aside. Craigslist buyers are all sorts, right? The guy showed up about an hour later, around time, which already struck me as a little unusual. People are rarely punctual when they're buying something off Craigslist. He was tall, with dark hair, kind of scruffy looking, and wearing a leather jacket. Nothing unusual there. At first, it seemed pretty normal. He was definitely eyeing the guitar with interest, and I could tell he was trying not to show too much excitement. We talked for a bit, and he immediately offered me cash. No haggling, no trying to talk me down on price. Just straight up, no nonsense. That was a red flag, but at the time I thought, hey, maybe he's just a serious buyer. He asked if he could try the guitar out, which I agreed to, but only reluctantly. I hadn't picked it up in so long that I was honestly kind of glad to see someone actually appreciating it. As he began to strum the guitar, something about the way he was moving started to make me feel uneasy. He was good, no doubt about it, but there was something in the way he was playing that felt off. It wasn't the music, it was the way he kept looking over his shoulder. His eyes kept darting toward the back of the house like he was searching for something. The back door was nearby, and I couldn't help but feel like he was scanning for an escape route or something else. My instincts kicked in, but I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself he was probably just nervous about buying something this valuable, and I turned to grab the receipt I had written out, planning to complete the transaction. That's when everything went to hell. The moment I turned my back, he lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. The shock was so sudden that it took me a second to realize what was happening. He grabbed my arms and pinned me down hard, his weight pressing into me. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to break free. Where's the rest of it? He hissed, his voice low and threatening. I could feel his breath on my face, and for a second, all I could think about was how wrong everything felt. He wasn't here for the guitar. This wasn't about buying an instrument at all. His eyes were wide, frantic, and all I could see was rage behind them. He didn't care about the guitar at all. The whole thing had just been a ruse, a way to get inside my home. I realized in that instant that I was in serious danger. He was asking about the rest of it, and the only thing I could think of was that he was looking for cash, valuables, or something I didn't know about. The weirdness of the situation hit me like a wave, and I started to panic. This guy had planned this from the beginning, and it was just a mark. I had to get out of this. I didn't have much time. I couldn't just lie there and let him take whatever he wanted. I knew if I didn't act fast, things were going to get a lot worse. My mind raced and adrenaline kicked in. I quickly tried to shift my body weight and wriggle out from underneath him, but he was strong. Way stronger than I expected. I had to think quick. I had to use what I had. In a moment of sheer panic, I remembered the small set of ropes I kept in the kitchen drawer. It was a habit I had from doing a little home improvement stuff, and it was the only thing that came to mind. It wasn't much, but I needed something to defend myself. As I struggled under his weight, I grabbed a piece of rope off the counter and swung it toward his wrists. He hesitated for just a second. Maybe he was surprised I had the strength to fight back, but that was all I needed. I twisted it around his hands, pulling it tight before he could react. For a moment, the struggle became even more frantic. He was trying to break free, and I was trying to stay on top of the situation. I don't know where I found the strength, but I kept fighting, keeping him pinned down and wrapping more rope around him. In that moment, my only focus was surviving. I wasn't thinking about the guitar or the money or anything else. It was just about making sure he didn't get away, that he didn't get his hands on me or anything I held dear. I didn't know how long the struggle lasted, but eventually I managed to get him tied up. I was shaking, heart racing, but I knew I couldn't let up. I grabbed my phone from the table, dialing the police as quickly as I could. My hands were still trembling, but I forced myself to stay calm. I explained what had happened and gave them my address, praying they'd get here fast. It felt like an eternity before the sirens finally pierced the silence. When the police arrived, they found me sitting there, exhausted, still keeping an eye on the guy who was now fully restrained. He had stopped struggling by then, and I could tell by the look in his eyes that he knew he wasn't going anywhere. The cops took over from there, cuffing him and leading him out of my house. Apparently, he had a record, and this wasn't his first time trying something like this. After everything was over, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I had come to being the victim of something much worse. I thought about how I had almost let my guard down, how I had let my nerves cloud my instincts. The guitar was still sitting there in the corner of the room, just as it had been before, but now it felt like a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I've learned since then to trust my gut. I'll never let someone into my home again without a little more caution. And Craigslist? Yeah, I'm sticking to selling things in public places from now on. Some deals just aren't worth the risk. I've been hunting for a second-hand phone for a while. My old one had started glitching, and with money being tight, I was about to drop hundreds on a brand new one. So when I found a decent model listed on Craigslist at a price that seemed too good to be true, I couldn't resist. The ad was simple: used phone, good condition. Needs gone soon. Price negotiable. No pics of the phone, just the basic details, but I figured I could take a look, maybe haggle a bit, and if everything checked out, I'd get a new-to-me phone without the hefty price tag. I texted the number listed in the ad, and within minutes I had a reply. The seller didn't seem too interested in talking much. He gave me an address and a time to meet, no small talk or back and forth. Just meet at 3 p.m. Come to the side door. So I did what anyone else would do when faced with a deal that seemed too easy. I figured I'd be in and out. When I pulled up to the house, I immediately noticed how off it felt. The house wasn't exactly rundown, but it had that neglected, forgotten look. Blinds half drawn, lawn unkempt. I rang the bell, and a guy opened the door almost immediately. He was in his late 20s, early 30s maybe. His clothes were a bit wrinkled, like he'd been in a rush. He had this weird energy about him, like he was anxious or trying to get me out the door as quickly as possible. He barely greeted me, just motioned for me to come inside. "I'm just trying to get rid of it," he muttered, holding up a phone in one hand. "This phone's been through a lot. Don't get too attached." I remember raising an eyebrow. It was an odd thing to say, but I chalked it up to the guy being a little strange. I wasn't looking for some deep conversation, just a phone, so I shrugged it off. I took the phone from him, inspected it quickly. It looked fine. A little scratch on the back, but nothing serious. I handed him the cash, he handed me the phone, and that was that. He practically ushered me out the door after that, and I thought nothing more of it. I got home, eager to swap out my old, glitchy phone. As soon as I turned it on, though, things started to feel off. It was probably just my head playing tricks on me. The phone felt too cold to be normal, like it had been sitting in the fridge or something. I ignored it and moved on to setting it up. That's when things started to get weird. Within an hour, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was one of those messages that make you feel a little uneasy, even if it doesn't make any sense. It just said, "Don't forget me." I stared at the screen for a minute, thinking maybe it was some wrong number or spam, but didn't stop there. A few minutes later, another message came through. "I'm still here." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't recognize the number. The messages didn't make sense, but something about the way they were worded felt familiar. I figured I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just someone who had the wrong number or some weird random spam. I blocked the number and tried to forget about it. But then the texts kept coming. Different numbers, different messages, but always the same cryptic tone. "I'm watching you," one said. Another, "You can't escape me." It felt like I was being taunted. The thing is, these messages weren't just random. They knew too much. The texts weren't just vague threats. They referenced little things I'd never mentioned to anyone. They knew about my childhood pet. They mentioned my old apartment by name, and they even referenced a vacation I'd taken years ago. No one should know that much about me. And they definitely shouldn't be able to get it from just a secondhand phone. I freaked out. I went over everything I could think of. The guy I bought the phone from had seemed so normal at first. I thought maybe he was just trying to unload something without much care, but now it felt like he'd been trying to get rid of something more than just a phone. I wondered if the phone itself was cursed, or if someone had planted something on it to track me or mess with my life. Either way, it was too much to ignore. After a couple of hours of nonstop cryptic texts, I decided I wasn't going to sit back and let this continue. I took the phone to the police. I showed them the messages, and they didn't seem too surprised. They asked if I knew the previous owner of the phone, and of course I didn't. They ran the serial number and tried to trace the phone, but there was no record of it. It was like it was completely wiped clean, like it had never existed. The officer gave me a strange look and said they'd do what they could, but that I should stop using the phone and change all my accounts immediately. I didn't feel better, but I appreciated that they took me seriously. I went home that night feeling scared. It was more than just the messages. Something about the way the guy had handed me the phone, the weird urgency in his voice, stuck with me. Like maybe he wasn't just selling the phone, maybe he was trying to get rid of something. Something dangerous. But why me? The next morning, I woke up to a new text. This time, it wasn't from an unknown number. It was a picture. A picture of me from the street, outside my own house, taken sometime during the night. I hadn't heard anyone outside, hadn't seen a thing. But there it was, plain as day. Me, standing in the front yard in my pajamas, looking out at the window. I don't know how it happened, but it felt like I had just crossed some invisible line. I wasn't just the owner of a secondhand phone anymore. I was someone else's target. The phone was now off, sitting in a drawer, and I didn't dare turn it back on. But I couldn't get the thought out of my mind. Who was watching me? Why? And what the hell was I supposed to do next? I still had that phone locked away in a drawer, but I don't trust it. I don't trust anything about it. I don't know what happened to the guy who sold it to me or what his real intentions were, but I know this. I will never buy another secondhand phone again. Some things are just better left untouched. I've never been one to make impulse buys, but when I found that car, I couldn't resist. It was a classic, looked almost brand new for its age, and the price was way too good to pass up. I'd been hunting for a car for months, and when I saw the ad on Craigslist, I jumped at the chance. The seller was a middle-aged guy who seemed friendly enough, said he was moving out of state and needed to offload it quickly. Everything seemed fine at the time, so I went ahead and bought it. I'm not usually one to trust people immediately, but the whole thing felt legit, so I didn't think twice. The car was a beauty, a sleek silver sedan, and when I got behind the wheel, everything felt smooth. The drive back home was perfect, almost like it was meant to be. There was one thing though, the glove compartment. It wasn't anything strange at first glance, but it didn't open easily, like something was wedged inside. It felt a little odd, but I figured it was just some junk or paperwork the previous owner left behind. A couple of days later, I decided to take it to a local garage for a quick inspection. Nothing crazy, just a routine check to make sure everything was good. It wasn't until they started going through the car that things took a turn. The mechanic, a guy I knew from around town, called me over. He looked a little pale, like something was off. He told me they'd found something in the glove box. It wasn't a big deal, just some old papers and junk, right? But no, it wasn't. It was a plastic bag neatly tucked in the corner. Inside the bag was a gun. I froze. The mechanic wasn't sure what to do, but I could tell he was on edge. He told me it was probably best to call the cops, which at that point seemed like the only logical choice. I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't help the panic that started creeping in. I'm not the type of person to get into anything sketchy, and I sure as hell didn't want anything to do with a gun I found in the glove box of a car I had just bought. My first thought was that the previous owner had hidden it there, either by accident or because he had some sort of connection to it. Either way, I wasn't about to just ignore it. So I called the cops. The whole thing felt surreal, like some sort of twisted scene out of a movie. I sat there, trying to explain what happened, but I couldn't focus. The garage wasn't far from my place, so I just walked around the block while I waited for them to show up. I don't know why I walked, maybe it was just to clear my head, but it didn't help. I felt a knot in my stomach the entire time. The image of the bag with the gun inside it would leave my mind. When the cops finally arrived, it felt like everything moved in slow motion. They took control of the situation, making sure to handle everything carefully. I didn't know what to expect. Was I going to be arrested? Were they going to accuse me of having something to do with it? The last thing I wanted was to get caught up in something illegal. But the cops didn't seem to be pointing fingers. They just asked me a few basic questions about the car and its history. The whole situation became even weirder when they checked the registration and realized that the car was still registered under the previous owner's name. Apparently, he hadn't even bothered to take care of the paperwork when he sold it to me. Not a huge red flag, but it didn't sit right with me. The gun, the disorganized paperwork, the strange condition of the car, it all seemed like too much of a coincidence. The police took the gun as evidence, but they didn't tell me anything more at that point. I was left sitting in the waiting area at the garage alone with my thoughts. I had somehow stepped into something that I shouldn't have. The more I thought about the whole situation, the more I started to wonder about the previous owner. What kind of person was he? And what had the gun been used for? The cops eventually let me go, telling me they'd be in touch. I left the garage, but my mind was still racing. The whole time I drove home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following me. I don't know why. I guess it was just that nagging feeling that maybe I had gotten myself tangled up in something I couldn't just walk away from. When I got home, I parked the car in the driveway and sat in the driver's seat for a while. I didn't want to go inside. I just stared at the house, thinking about what had happened. It felt like there was a part of the story I wasn't seeing. The gun, the plastic bag, the weird situation with the paperwork, it all felt too connected to be random. I had no idea what the police were going to do with the gun, or if it had anything to do with me. I still didn't know if the seller had hidden it there on purpose or if it was an accident. The whole thing didn't add up. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They told me that they had located the previous owner. He had a record, nothing too crazy, but enough to make me feel uncomfortable. It turned out that the gun wasn't registered, and they were now trying to trace its origins. They asked me if I knew anything about it, but I honestly didn't. I just wanted to be done with the whole thing. I ended up keeping the car, though. They didn't find anything linking me to the gun or the previous owner, and eventually they closed the case. But I couldn't shake the weirdness of it all. Every time I drove the car, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it that I would never know. I never thought selling a PC would end up like this. It started off normal enough. I posted it on Craigslist, just a solid desktop that I didn't need anymore. It had a decent GPU and was good for gaming or light editing, nothing fancy, but still a good rig. I listed it for a fair price, trying to get some cash so I could upgrade my setup. Took a couple of days for anyone to bite, but then this guy emailed me. Said he was interested, wanted to pick it up ASAP. So I gave him my address and told him to swing by that evening. Now, at this point, everything seemed pretty standard. I didn't have any weird feelings about it. Craigslist is known for being a little sketchy, but it's not like it was my first time selling stuff online. I've done a bunch before. The guy said his name was David, sounded pretty normal. He even sent me a text to confirm the meeting. It was going to be at 7 p.m., and I told him that it'd work. Fast forward a few hours, I get a knock on the door. I open it, and there's this dude standing there, holding a big envelope full of cash. The guy's maybe in his mid-30s, looks like he's been at a desk all day. No big deal. I show him the PC, he takes a quick look at it, says it looks perfect, and then hands me the envelope. I take it, give him the computer, and he's off. Simple transaction, right? I go inside, open up the envelope, and count the money. It was $500, all in $20 bills. That was exactly what I was asking for. At first, everything seemed fine, but then I started to get this weird feeling like something wasn't quite right. You know that sensation when everything seems too smooth? Like the fact he didn't haggle, didn't try to ask for a discount, and just handed over the cash without a second thought. It felt off, but I ignored it. Maybe he just wanted the computer badly or something. I figured I'd take the money to the bank tomorrow, deposit it, and move on with my life. The next morning, I drive to the bank. I'm just thinking about upgrading my rig and how this little sale would give me extra funds. The teller at the window is a younger woman. She smiles, takes the envelope from me, and starts counting the money. As she's doing it, her face changes. Not in a major way, but enough that I notice. She stops for a second, glances over at her manager, and then looks back at me with a strained smile. "Could I get you to come over here for a second?" she asks, her voice way too calm. My stomach does this weird twist. Something is definitely wrong. I follow her over to another counter. She starts flipping through the bills more carefully, almost like she's trying to find something. Then she stops, holds up a bill, and says, "I'm afraid this money's marked as stolen. I'm going to have to seize it." I freeze. The world doesn't make sense for a second. Marked as stolen. What the hell? I immediately ask her what that means. But she just repeats the same thing, that they can't accept the money because it's flagged. She doesn't really give me any more details than that. It's like I'm in a daze as she hands the envelope back to me and tells me I need to leave. I'm walking back to my car, trying to process this, and I just feel dumb. How could I not have noticed something was off? I keep thinking about the guy. He was so smooth, so calm. I didn't even get his last name. What kind of person hands over hundreds in cash without blinking? Something about him didn't sit right with me, but now I feel like an idiot for not trusting that gut feeling. I call police to see if they can help me. They tell me they can't do anything unless I file a report, but they're more interested in the source of the stolen money than helping me out. They tell me I need to go back to the bank and get more details from them. Of course, the bank isn't much help either. They just tell me they can't share any more information for security reasons. So I'm left with this big, gnawing pit in my stomach and no idea what to do next. I try to move on with my day, but I can't. I keep thinking about the guy, about the money. How did it get into his hands? Why was it marked as stolen? I start going through all the things I didn't ask when he was standing in front of me. His odd calmness, the fact he didn't ask any questions about the computer, the fact he didn't hesitate for a second with the cash. It all starts to feel like a setup. A couple of days later, I can't take it anymore. I decide to track the guy down. I go back to the Craigslist post, hoping he might have left some sort of trail like a phone number or an email. But it's gone. No trace. The post has been deleted. I search for any sort of clue, any kind of way to track him down, but it's like he never existed. I even go back to the bank, hoping they'll tell me more about the money or if it's connected to anything else, but they're still stonewalling me. The only thing I can get is that the money was flagged by a security system tied to recent stolen cash in the area, but beyond that, nothing. And I'm still sitting here with a bunch of cash I can't do anything with, feeling like I've been duped. The more I think about it, the more I realize how little I really know about the guy who bought the PC. He could have been anyone, and now I'm stuck with this situation. What if the whole thing was a setup? What if the money was dirty all along? And what the hell do I do now? I can't just walk away from this. I should have known better. Should have trusted my gut. I still don't know what in God's name happened. It was one of those days where everything seemed to line up just right. I'd just moved into my first apartment and was trying to stretch every penny as far as I could. The place was old, the rent was cheap, but it came with the usual downsides: no furniture and barely any storage. So like any smart person on a budget, I turned to Craigslist. I found this post about a set of cheap furniture, a couch and a couple of chairs that seemed perfect for my little living room. The seller wasn't asking much, which should have been my first red flag. But when you're just starting out, you don't really care about red flags. You care about cheap furniture. The guy was a little off, to say the least. He texted me a few times to confirm when I could pick it up, and each message felt rushed, like he just wanted to get rid of the stuff as quickly as possible. But I didn't think much of it. People move. People need things gone fast. Maybe he was moving for a new job or something, I figured. I showed up at his house on the day we agreed. It was a neighborhood that was quiet too quiet, like the kind of place where all the houses look the same and nobody bothers to talk to their neighbors. He opened the door before I even knocked, almost as if he was expecting me. He wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a plain shirt and jeans. Nothing that stood out, except maybe the way he was standing a little too close to the door, almost like he was blocking it. I didn't think anything of it. He led me inside, pointed to the furniture stacked in the corner, and started rambling about how he just needed to get rid of it. The couch was pretty basic, a little older than I expected, but in decent shape. The chairs weren't anything special, but I could make it work. The guy was eager, almost too eager to get everything out of the house and into my car. I remember how quickly he helped me load it up, like he was rushing me out the door. He didn't even offer to help set it up when I got back to my place. I paid him, flipped the furniture, and left without a second thought. I should have known something was off, but honestly, I was just happy to have the furniture for such a low price. Once I got back to my apartment, I noticed the couch had a weird smell. It wasn't exactly awful, but it was musty like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I figured it was just old fabric or something. I was tired, so I shrugged it off, flopped onto the couch, and tried to get some rest. But then I felt it, this cold draft blowing across my legs. It was weird because all windows were shut, and the heat was on. I pulled a blanket over me and tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the old building settling or something. That night, I went to bed like usual, but around 2 a.m. I woke up to a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or maybe some mice in the walls. I lived in an old building, so that wasn't out of the question. But then it got louder. It wasn't just the walls anymore. It was moving, getting closer, like whatever was making the noise was moving through the room. My heart started racing. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the scratching wasn't stopping. I threw the covers off and got up, walking around my apartment trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It wasn't until I reached the couch that I realized the scratching sound was coming from beneath it, from inside the couch. My gut dropped. I could feel something weird in the air, like everything around me was getting colder, and not just from the draft. I grabbed a flashlight and moved the couch slightly. That's when I noticed the wetness on the underside. It wasn't soaked, but the fabric felt damp, like it had been sitting in moisture for a while. My heart was racing, and I tried to convince myself that it was just water damage from the old building. But then I saw it. A dried bloodstain right under where I'd been sitting. My blood ran cold. I don't know why, but I flipped the couch over. I half expected to find something I couldn't explain, beneath it. And I was right. On the fabric, there were more stains, dark brown and red, all over the bottom of the couch. I couldn't breathe for a second. I tried to convince myself it was old stains, maybe from something that happened a long time ago. But it didn't make sense. Who sells a couch with bloodstains on it, and why hadn't the guy mentioned anything? I didn't even want to think about it, but the more I looked at the stains, the more I realized how wrong this whole situation felt. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the seller, but the number was disconnected. No voicemail. Nothing. My hand was shaking as I ended the call. I was about to sit down and think about my next move when I heard the scratching sound again. It was louder now, closer, like it was coming from the walls again. But it wasn't in the walls. It was coming from inside the couch. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away from it. I couldn't sit on that thing anymore. There was something wrong with it. There was something wrong with the entire situation. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed up, staring at the couch, terrified of what was hiding inside it. In the morning, I called a moving company to have the furniture taken away, and I didn't even care about the cost at that point. I wanted it gone. But no matter how many times I tried to forget, I had the feeling that the furniture had come with something more than just bad luck. Something dark. Something dangerous. It all started with a simple Craigslist listing. The kind you see all the time, no big deal. Someone was giving away a wooden toy chest. The description was basic. Old wooden toy chest. Had it for years, belonged to my grandmother. Just want it gone. It was free and it looked perfect for what I needed. I just moved into my first apartment, and I was looking for anything to fill the space without spending a ton of money. The picture was blurry, but the chest itself looked like something out of an antique store. Old, sturdy, a little worn, but full of character. I couldn't resist. The seller lived about 30 minutes outside of town, which didn't bother me at all. I was getting a free piece of furniture. I made arrangements, and the next day I headed out to grab it. When I got there, the house was kind of strange. It was an old, one-story place on the edge of town, tucked back behind some trees. You wouldn't even notice it unless you were looking for it. The yard was overgrown with weeds. The house looked like it hadn't been painted in years, and there were boxes piled on the front porch. As I stood there, waiting for someone to come to the door, I couldn't help but wonder why someone would give away something so nice. but it was free and I didn't care too much. The door opened after a few seconds and an older man stepped out. He looked exactly like what you'd expect. A little rough around the edges, probably in his mid-60s, and wearing a faded t-shirt with holes in it. His face had a strange, almost glazed look like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say much, just nodded when I introduced myself and gestured for me to follow him inside. It was a little awkward, but I was too focused on the chest to care about his odd behavior. The chest was in a small room in the back of the house, resting against a wall covered in peeling wallpaper. It was beautiful, though, dark wood, with brass hinges and a smooth finish. I could see where the edges had been scuffed up over the years, but it only added to the charm. There was something nostalgic about it, like it had stories to tell. The man didn't say much as I loaded it into my car, but he kept glancing at it, almost like he didn't want me to take it. But then again, maybe I was just imagining things. I didn't think much of it when I got home. I had a few things to unpack, and I set the chest in my bedroom, figuring I'd organize it later. The apartment was pretty empty, and I had no idea what I was going to use the chest for, but I liked the idea of it just sitting there in the corner. I was used to things being a little quiet, so when I heard a faint tapping noise later that night, I didn't think much of it. The sound was subtle, almost like something was gently knocking against the wood. At first, I figured it was just the house settling. I'd been in the place for a few days, and old buildings always have those random noises, right? I shrugged it off, but the tapping kept happening. Every night. It started faintly at first, like someone knocking on the door from the other side of the wall. But as the days passed, it grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't enough to wake me up, but it was definitely noticeable. After about a week of this, I decided I needed to check it out. I opened the chest. It was empty, except for a bit of dust. The tapping had stopped immediately when I had opened it. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was just my imagination. Or maybe the chest had some kind of weird resonance, like an old instrument, I don't know. I closed it again, locked it, and tried to forget about the whole thing. But the tapping didn't stop. At night, it grew louder. It sounded almost frantic, like someone was desperate to get out. I tried everything I could to ignore it. I turned on music. I left the apartment for a few hours. I put earplugs in. But every night there it was, the tapping, echoing in the back of my mind. I even tried to stay up and catch it happening, but it always seemed to stop when I was paying attention. I wasn't sure what to do. My friends told me I was just being paranoid. It's an old piece of furniture, they said. Maybe it's just the wood creaking. But it didn't feel like that. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. A few more nights passed before I finally decided to investigate it further. I couldn't take the noise anymore. The tapping was driving me nuts, and something in my gut told me I had to open the chest and figure out what the hell was going on. I almost didn't want to. The idea of what I might find in there scared me, like I couldn't live with the constant noise. I went into my room that night after the tapping had started again. I grabbed the flashlight from my desk and slowly walked over to the chest. I couldn't explain it, but there was a strange weight in the air, like something was waiting for me. I opened the chest carefully. The dust had settled, and everything looked the same as before. But as I shined the light into the chest, I saw something new. Small, dusty handprints were smudged across the inside of the lid. I froze. I don't have kids. I don't know who or what could have made those handprints. They weren't big, and they weren't messy like a child's would be. They were neat, like someone had placed their hands there deliberately. My heart was pounding as I closed the lid and backed away slowly. The tapping stopped immediately. Just like that, it was gone. I didn't know what to think anymore. The whole thing felt wrong, like I had opened something I wasn't supposed to. I grabbed my phone and tried calling the seller, but the number was disconnected. I couldn't sleep that night. The handprints were burned into my mind. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the chest, wondering what the hell I had brought into my apartment. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to deal with it anymore. I called a friend, told them I needed help, and we took the chest out of my apartment together. I don't know what those handprints meant, but I'm not going to look for answers. I was just scrolling through Craigslist, killing time like I do most days, when I stumbled across the free arts section. Normally, I'd glance over that stuff and move on. But today, something about it caught my eye. I think it was just one of those random moments where your brain gets hooked by something that doesn't seem that interesting, but your curiosity takes over anyway. I found a post from an artist claiming they needed to clear out their studio and were giving away some of their paintings for free. The description was vague, just saying they were getting rid of a few older works that didn't fit their current style. No pictures, no names, just a promise that the art was free to a good home. Now, I've never been the type to collect art or anything like that, but there was something kind of intriguing about the idea of free stuff, especially art. You don't really find it every day. So I shot them a quick message. Maybe they'd get back to me, maybe not, but at least I tried. To my surprise, the seller replied within minutes. They gave me an address, told me to stop by any time during the day, and even mentioned that there were some paintings that had been in their family for years. They didn't seem too enthusiastic, though. It was almost like they wanted to get rid of these things, and fast. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I should have trusted that gut feeling. Anyway, I decided to go check it out. I didn't want to waste the opportunity for free art, so I headed over right away. It was a little out of the way, kind of in a sketchy part of town, and the building itself looked like it was about to collapse. The place was tucked away behind an old convenience store, and when I walked in, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was musty, stale, and a little sour, like something hadn't been cleaned in years. The seller didn't greet me or anything. Instead, I found myself standing in the middle of what used to be a studio. There were empty canvases leaning against the walls, piles of brushes and paint tubes scattered across the floor, and broken easels in the corner. It didn't feel like a creative space. It felt like a place where creativity had long died and left everything behind. I walked over to the stack of paintings the seller had mentioned. Most of them were abstract or weirdly colored landscapes. Nothing that jumped out at me until I spotted one. It was a portrait, an old man with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I moved. His face was pale, with thin wrinkles, and his expression was just wrong. It wasn't that the painting itself was poorly done. On the contrary, the detail was impeccable. But there was something unsettling about those eyes. It almost felt like they were staring straight through me, into my soul. I could feel my stomach tighten, but I was too curious to back out now. The seller, who I noticed was standing behind me in the corner of the room, mentioned that the portrait had belonged to their grandmother. They said they were just trying to clear out some old stuff and didn't really have any use for it anymore. When I asked about the artist, they just waved it off. "It doesn't really matter," they said with a dismissive shrug. "Just take it if you want it." I didn't ask more questions, but looking back, that moment felt wrong. The whole atmosphere felt wrong. I grabbed the painting, rolled it up, and shoved it into my car. I figured it was just an old painting, nothing to worry about. I was a little weirded out by the eyes, but I've always been a sucker for free things, so I pushed that unease aside. When I got home, I unrolled the painting and hung it up in my living room. As soon as I did, a sudden chill filled the room, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees in a matter of seconds. I thought it was just the old building, the kind that had drafty walls and windows that never quite sealed properly. I didn't think much of it. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. I just had a weird feeling like something wasn't quite right. I glanced over at the painting across the room. The old man's eyes, they were staring at me. It was subtle at first, but as I turned my head to go back to sleep, I noticed the eyes weren't where they had been when I first hung it up. They were turned slightly toward me, following my movement. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just tired. But the next night it happened again. The old man's eyes were following me, always watching, always moving. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I could see it clear as day. The worst part, it wasn't even just when I was awake. A few nights later, I woke up in the dark, the room completely silent. The eyes of the painting were still locked on me, but this time, the face looked more distorted. The once smooth lines of the painting now seemed cracked, like something was bubbling under the surface of the canvas. The paint around his eyes was starting to split, as though it was beginning to peel away, revealing something flesh-colored underneath. It wasn't paint anymore. It was skin. I freaked out. I tried to take the painting down, but when I reached up to pull it off the wall, the frame wouldn't budge. It was like it was glued in place, locked to the wall by some unseen force. No matter how hard I pulled, the damn thing wouldn't move. I was starting to panic. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and tried to pry the frame off the wall. It didn't help. The more I struggled, the more the eyes seemed to shift. I didn't know what to do. I knew I had to get rid of it, but I couldn't take it down. It was like the painting had become a part of the wall, like it was embedded there, refusing to leave. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I ended up sleeping with the lights on, my back to the painting. When I finally couldn't take it anymore, I took the painting down in one final, desperate move, hoping that I could just burn it or something. But as soon as I removed the frame from the wall, it was gone. Just like that. No paint. No old man. It was like it had never been there at all. I didn't know what happened to it. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just going crazy. But I haven't seen that painting since, and I never want to see it again. I don't know who or what was behind that old painting, but I'm sure as hell not looking for any more free art anytime soon. I was on Craigslist, just browsing like I usually do when I saw this listing that caught my eye. It wasn't flashy, no big photos or fancy descriptions, just a simple table for sale, $50. It didn't have much else, but something about it seemed intriguing. The price was right, and I'd been looking for a new table for my kitchen, so I figured why not. The seller's description was vague. It mentioned it was an old piece, some wear and tear, but solid. Honestly, it sounded like the perfect project for me. I liked the idea of getting something that had a bit of history behind it. Maybe I could sand it down or finish it and make it my own. I arranged to pick it up that weekend. When I arrived at the seller's house, it was a tiny little place in a quiet neighborhood. The house was a little run down, but nothing too out of the ordinary. The table was waiting for me in the front yard, and as soon as I saw it, I knew it was exactly what I was looking for. It had that rustic, worn-down vibe I loved. The wood was a little scratched, but it was sturdy enough. I didn't mind a few imperfections. The seller, a middle-aged guy, seemed eager to get rid of it. He said he was moving and didn't have room for it in his new place. He seemed like he wanted to get the transaction over with quickly, almost like he was in a rush. He didn't say much else, just handed me the table and a vague, "It's yours now." I loaded it up in my car, and by the time I got home, it was getting late. I didn't feel like doing much with it that night, so I just left it in the living room, covered with a sheet to protect it from dust. I planned to get started on it the next morning. But that night, I woke up at some point, not sure why. It wasn't that I heard anything, but something felt off. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to get back to sleep. That's when I remembered the table. I hadn't really gotten a good look at it when I first got it, so I decided to check it out before I went back to bed. I got up, grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight, and walked into the living room. The sheet was still draped over the table. I pulled it off, expecting to see the same old table, but something was different. I could see it now clearly under the dim light of my phone. The scratches on the wood, not just any random scratches, but lines. Thin, deliberate lines, almost like someone had carved into it. At first, I thought it was just wear and tear, but as I ran my fingers over the grooves, I realized they weren't random. The scratches formed patterns, but it wasn't until I leaned in closer that I saw what they actually were: names. Names carved deep into the wood, one after another. The first few were hard to read, almost faded, but I could make out the beginnings of them. The letters were uneven, like they were scratched in a hurry. And then, as my eyes moved along the table, I saw more names. Some were scratched off, faded, as though someone had tried to remove them, but they weren't fully gone. Others were clear, readable. I felt a weird chill run through me as I traced my fingers along the lines. It felt like I was touching something wrong, something personal. I scanned through the list, not sure why, but my eyes wouldn't stop. The names seemed to go on forever. And then I saw it. My name. Right there in the middle of the table, scratched into the wood, just like the others. My first name in deep, uneven lines. It didn't make any sense. There was no way it could have been done by the previous owner. He wouldn't know my name, but there it was, plain as day. And even though I couldn't remember ever seeing it, it looked like it had been there for a long time, like it belongs. A weird sensation washed over me. I should have been freaked out, I know, but instead, I felt strangely drawn to it. I almost didn't want to pull my hand away, but I did quickly, as if I had been doing something wrong. I stood there in the middle of my living room, holding my breath, staring at my name on the table. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how it could even be possible. I knew it was just some weird coincidence. There was no way the guy who sold me the table could have known my name. Right. I grabbed my phone and tried to get a better look at the other names, but they were hard to read in the dark. I walked over to the light switch and flicked it on. The light buzzed for a second before finally turning on, flooding the room in brightness. I looked back at the table. That's when I saw it. The names that had been scratched off, the ones that were barely visible, it weren't all random. There was a pattern. Each name had a line drawn through it, But as my eyes scanned over the table again, I realized it wasn't just any line. It was like someone was crossing them off one by one, as if those people had been removed. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I scanned the names again. There were more crossed out names. Then another line through one, and another. My mind was starting to race. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was I just paranoid? And then, at the very end of the list, the most recent name scratched into the wood. Mine. I stepped back, feeling the air grow heavy in the room. My eyes were glued to the table, my breath shallow. My name was crossed out, just like the others. I didn't know what to think. All I could do was stand there and stare at it, unable to move. My mind wouldn't stop racing, trying to piece together what I was seeing. It wasn't until the next day that I tried calling the seller, hoping for some explanation. But when I called the number, it went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking about the table, and if there was any explanation for the strange scratches. No answer. I haven't been able to get rid of the table. And the worst part, the list keeps growing. The names keep appearing slowly, like someone's adding them. I'm scared to check it again, but also terrified of not knowing what's going to happen next. I don't know who carved those names into that table or why mine's on there, but I have a feeling it's not a good sign. It started with something simple, like most bad decisions do. I was scrolling through Craigslist one evening, looking for a new couch. Mine had been falling apart for months, and I just couldn't justify buying something new. So when I saw a listing for a free couch, I thought, why not? It was in good condition, just a little worn according to the ad. Perfect, right? The seller's message was short. Come pick it up if you want it. But whatever, free couch, can't beat that. I shot him a quick text to confirm the address, and the next day I was on my way. When I got to the house, things were a little off. I mean, not in a super obvious way, but just weird. The guy who greeted me seemed a little too eager to get rid of the couch. He didn't say much, just pointed me toward the couch, and then handed it off to me with hardly any words. He was moving fast, almost like he had somewhere to be, but it wasn't like he was angry or anything. Just distant, maybe. It was a little strange, but whatever, I thought. People act weird all the time, and it was a free couch. I loaded it into my car and headed home. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. It was a free couch. What could possibly go wrong? Well, let me tell you. As soon as I got home and set it up in my living room, I noticed something. There was this dark stain on one of the cushions. At first, I thought maybe something had spilled on it during the move, but it didn't look like any kind of liquid I could identify. It was a deep reddish brown, almost black, but it didn't look like coffee, wine, or anything else I could think of. I tried scrubbing at it, but nothing worked. It wouldn't come out. I figured maybe I'd try again in the morning, so I left it alone for the night. That night, I had my first nightmare. I couldn't remember much about it, just flashes. There were dark, suffocating hallways, a muffled voice calling my name, and a shadow in the corner of the room that didn't belong there. I woke up with a cold sweat, my heart racing. It wasn't anything too bad, but it stuck with me. I brushed it off, told myself it was probably just the stress of the move and adjusting to a new place. But the dreams didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Each night, they became more vivid, more disturbing. One dream involved me sitting on a couch, feeling this strange coldness wash over me, and then hearing someone whisper my name. I turned around, and there was no one there. Another dream was me sitting in a pitch-black room, and the only light came from the couch, but the light kept flickering like it was trying to warn me about something I couldn't see. The weirdest part, I felt the same cold, unsettling feeling when I woke up, like the air around me was different. And it wasn't just the dreams, it was everything. I started to feel like the couch was watching me, like it wasn't just a couch anymore. The more I sat on it, the more I felt off, like I wasn't alone in the room. Every time I'd be on it, I'd glance up at the corner of the room or at the door, just expecting someone to be there. The final straw came a few nights later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, just this soft, almost rhythmic scratching sound that came from the couch. It sounded like someone was slowly dragging their nails against the fabric. I tried to ignore it, but it kept getting louder, like it was right next to me. I got up and turned on the light. Nothing. I checked the couch and saw that there was no sign of anything that could be making the noise. but the air was thick like the room was too quiet. The only sound now was my own breathing. That's when I knew I couldn't keep it anymore. Whatever was going on with this couch, it was messing with my head. I decided to get rid of it. I texted a few friends to see if anyone needed a free couch, but nobody would take it. One guy even told me it looked too weird for him to accept. I tried calling a few charities, but they didn't want it either. No one wanted the couch. It was like it had some invisible force around it that made people not want to touch it. I was getting desperate. I finally ended up dragging it outside, hoping that maybe someone would take off my hands if it was just sitting there on the curb. I didn't know what else to do. The very next day, I checked the spot where I'd left it. The couch was gone. I figured someone had come by and just taken it during the night, but when I looked around, I saw something that made my heart drop. The dark stain from the cushion was gone. I thought maybe it was just a weird coincidence, that maybe I hadn't noticed it before. But then the worst part happened. That night, I had another nightmare. This one felt real, almost like I wasn't sleeping at all. I was sitting on that cursed couch again, the one I had left out on the curb. It felt cold, like ice was spreading through me, and I could hear scratching noises again. Only this time they were louder. Closer. I turned my head, and standing in front of me was the man who had given me the couch. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me with this look like he was waiting for something. When I woke up, I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I reached over to the spot where the couch used to be, and in that moment I realized I had never put it out on the curb. It was still in my living room. And the stain, it was back. Don't know how it happened. Maybe I just imagined it, or maybe something else was going on. But the next time I tried to move the couch, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I tried to push it, it was like it was stuck to the floor. I've since moved, left all my stuff behind. I couldn't get out of that place fast enough. I don't know where that couch ended up, but I hope I never have to see it again. I don't know if you've ever had one of those moments where you look back and realize how much you should have trusted your gut. But this one, I should have listened to myself big time. It all started when I decided to sell my old PlayStation on Craigslist. I'd had it for years. It wasn't anything special. A bit outdated, but still worked fine. I had barely played it in the past few months and figured it was time to get rid of it. My place was getting cluttered and I was trying to downsize. I listed it for a pretty decent price. I got a few responses, but one guy stood out. His message was short. I'll take it. Where do I pick it up? I gave him my address and told him to come by whenever. At first, he seemed pretty normal, just another guy looking to buy an old console. But there was something about his responses that felt off. He was quick to agree to everything, and something in his tone made me think he wasn't all there. Maybe it was just my imagination. I mean, he wasn't rude or anything, so I went ahead and set up the meetup for later that afternoon. He arrived exactly on time, which is rare for anyone these days, so I figured that was a good sign. He looked kind of like I expected, mid-30s, a little unkempt, but nothing too unusual. He didn't say much at first, just glanced around when he stepped inside, looking at everything like he was scanning the place. I couldn't help but feel like I was being sized up. I handed him the PlayStation, and that's when things started to get weird. As he looked at the console, he made some offhanded comment about how old it was, like it was a shock to him that something could actually be that old and still work. But that was just the start. He started inspecting my living room, like really looking around at everything. The way he was staring at my walls, my bookshelf, the little things I had on display, it started to feel uncomfortable. He would randomly make remarks like, "You really like your books, huh?" Or, "Seems like you collect a lot of junk for someone who was living alone." I laughed it off at first, trying to keep it casual, but the comments kept coming. It felt like he was purposely trying to point out things about my place that were off. "That couch looks kind of old," he said. "And then, seems like you don't really care about the place much. The way it's all just kind of thrown together." At that point, I started to get a weird vibe, but I didn't want to be rude. Maybe he was just awkward. I don't know. It just felt like he was poking at things about me without saying it outright. Still, I tried to stay calm, acting like I didn't care about his weird observations. Then came the most uncomfortable part. He started walking around my living room, almost like he was making himself at home, even though I hadn't invited him in that far. He stepped up to my window and stared outside, not saying a word. I was just standing there feeling completely awkward as he looked at my neighborhood. And then he said something I didn't expect. Not a lot of life around here. I didn't know how to respond. What does that even mean? My neighborhood was fine, quiet, yeah, but not dead. I just gave him a half smile and nodded, hoping he'd take the hint. But instead, he kept talking, almost like he was rambling now, not much going on. Nothing to do, not much to look at. He kept staring out the window like there was something out there. When I followed his gaze, all I could see were a few houses, cars parked on the street, the usual neighborhood stuff. At this point, I was starting to wonder if I should just get the transaction over with and have him leave. But then he turned to me with this weird look in his eyes, and I knew it wasn't just the awkward small talk anymore. He stepped back toward the PlayStation, but before handing over the cash, he added, "You really ought to clean up more. Places like this, they get like this over time, don't they?" I was taken aback. What was he talking about? Places like what? My house wasn't even that messy. It wasn't pristine, but it wasn't falling apart either. He handed me the cash, and I tried to get him out of there. But then he said, "I wouldn't stay here too long. Not good to live in a place where no one cares enough to fix things." You know, I almost froze. What? He wasn't just commenting on the state of the house anymore. He was insulting me, and I didn't know how to respond. But before I could even process it, he turned and walked straight to the door, not looking back. I didn't even get a chance to say goodbye or thank him for buying it. He was out the door and gone before I could blink. I closed the door behind him and stood there in shock. What had just happened? I couldn't stop thinking about all the little things he said. It didn't make sense. It wasn't just that he was weird, he was insulting me all my life in this passive-aggressive way that made my skin crawl. I didn't know if it was me overthinking it or if he had just been playing some kind of game, but I had this sick feeling in my stomach. That night, I kept thinking back to the way he had looked at everything, the way he made me feel small. It wasn't the PlayStation he was buying into something else, and I couldn't figure out what. But the worst part came a few days later. I checked my phone for the first time after meeting him, and I had a message from a blocked number. It was a picture of my house from the street. The weird part, it was taken from the exact spot he had been standing by the window. I don't know how he got it, but the fact that he had that kind of access made me feel completely violated. I changed my locks the next day. I'm still not sure what he was trying to do, but I've never felt so uncomfortable about selling something online before. I'm never letting a stranger into my house again. And if I ever see that guy again, I'll know exactly what he meant.
Thanks for making it to the end. Subscribe to Wide Awake Horror. Please like and share.